Every morning he poured 2 cups of coffee, one for himself and one for the ghost that never left his table. Then came the morning when a girl with wind-chapped lips and a dress torn by miles collapsed at his porch. She didn't speak, didn't beg, just looked at the doorway like it was the last good thing left in the world. And in that quiet kitchen, where nothing had dared to stay, something finally did. Part 1, 2 cups of coffee and an empty chair. The wind in Wyoming didn't ask questions. It just came, hard or soft, and swept through the plains like it always had, dragging dust, snow, and memories alike. Caleb Rourke had grown used to its company. 10 years on that patch of land, and not once had the wind missed a morning. Neither had he. Even on the days when the stove took longer to light, even when his joints complained from the cold, even when his breath came out ragged and the silence in the cabin pressed in heavier than the snow outside. Each day began the same. Grind the beans by hand, fill the kettle from the rain barrel out back. Wait for the whistle, then pour 2 cups, one for himself, one for the chair across the table, the one no one had sat in for almost a decade. He never spoke her name anymore, not out loud. Folks in town had long since stopped mentioning her. Even the preacher had let her drift into the unspoken part of sermons. But the chair stayed right where it had always been, angled just so the morning light hit it first. Some mornings he would glance at that 2nd cup and think about dumping it out. It felt foolish keeping up a ritual meant for someone gone so long. But every time he stood with the cup in his hand, something in him stilled, and he sat down instead. On that particular morning, the clouds hung low, gray like lead wool across the sky. The wind had a damp edge to it, the kind that seeped through the chinks in the logs and curled into bones. The coffee boiled slower than usual. Caleb leaned against the doorframe and watched the steam rise, the same way he had yesterday and the day before that. He hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 weeks, not since old Roy from the feed store delivered a sack of oats and a few rusted tins of beans. Even then, Caleb had only nodded. Words weren't worth wasting if they didn't change anything. The porch creaked beneath his boots as he stepped outside with the cups. He set one down at the usual spot, the other he held, cupping it with both hands. That's when he heard it. Not the wind, not the groan of the barn roof settling in the cold, but something else. A sound like breath, or maybe the end of one. He turned his head, just off the edge of the porch, where the packed dirt path had turned to slush. There was a shape, small, slumped, colorless against the half-frozen mud. At first he thought it might be a coyote. Then the wind shifted and a tangle of hair moved. A person. He moved slow, not out of fear, but from habit. His boots left deep prints as he stepped off the porch and knelt beside the body. A girl. Young, but not a child. Dress soaked through, fabric torn at the hem. Her lips were chapped raw and her eyes were closed, but not in the peace of sleep. More like the kind of stillness that came from walking too long with no place to go. Caleb slid his arms under her without speaking and lifted. She weighed less than she should. He carried her inside. The fire had burned down to coals, but they stirred quickly with new wood. He wrapped her in the only dry thing close, a blanket draped over the old rocker. Then he reached for the sweater folded at the back of the chair. It was his wife's. He hadn't touched it in years, but it was the warmest thing he owned. She didn't wake, not right away, but her fingers moved slightly when he wrapped them around the mug of warm water. Not coffee. She didn't need that yet. Her skin was pale, but her brow wasn't fevered, just cold and tired. He sat across from her, same chair as always. The 2nd cup of coffee still steamed beside the empty place. Only it wasn't empty now. The girl stirred. Her eyes cracked open, dark, wary. She looked around the room, then at him. She didn't speak, but her gaze paused on the chair beside him, the one with the empty coffee cup. Then back at him again. Caleb didn't say a word. He just reached forward, pushed the mug of warm water an inch closer to her. Outside, the wind chimes rattled faintly. Inside, the only sound was the pop of pine sap in the fire. It had been 10 years since Caleb Rourke shared a room with another breath. But somehow, in that long silence, something in the cabin shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly. Just enough to let the air move differently. Just enough to make room for someone else. Part 2. A stranger girl with storms in her eyes. She didn't say her name, didn't ask for shelter or water or kindness, just stood there, soaked to the bone, face pale as dry snow, eyes wide like something hunted too long. The mud clung to the hem of her torn dress, and the wind shoved her sideways like it meant to finish what the road had started. She leaned against the doorframe as if it were the last upright thing in a world gone crooked. Caleb didn't move right away. He stood inside the kitchen, one hand still resting on the second coffee cup, half full, untouched. His boots didn't creak. His breath stayed even, but the steam from the stove wavered slightly, caught in that stillness, like it wasn't sure whether to rise or hold its place. The woman's eyes never left the open doorway. She looked at it not like she wanted to come in, but like she couldn't believe it hadn't been locked against her, as if this wooden frame, this chipped lintel and wind-beaten threshold held more meaning than a church door. Her hands shook, not from cold alone, but from a kind of weariness deeper than any fever. Caleb took a slow step toward the rack by the hearth, and didn't speak. Didn't clear his throat or make a sound to announce what he was doing. He simply reached for an old wool sweater, brown, stretched at the cuffs, frayed at the collar. It had belonged to Ruth. He hadn't touched it in years. He held it out. The girl blinked as if she hadn't realized he was real. She took the sweater with both hands, as careful as if he'd handed her a bird's egg. Then, without a word, she slid it over her shoulders. It hung off her thin frame like it remembered another body. Caleb turned and stoked the fire. The cast-iron stove was already warm, but he fed it another log anyway, nudging the embers gently, more out of habit than need. The kind of thing a man does when he doesn't know what to say but wants to keep something alive. She still hadn't stepped inside. The wind outside pulled hard at the eaves. The chimes hanging from the porch rafters clinked, not musically, but like bones caught in a restless rattle. That kind of wind didn't carry words. It carried warnings. Finally, the woman shifted. One bare foot crossed the threshold, then another. She didn't ask if she could enter, just moved in, slow and unsure, like someone trying not to wake the dust. The door clicked shut behind her, though neither of them reached for it. Caleb gestured with his chin toward the wooden chair near the stove, not the empty one across the table. That one stayed untouched, as always. She hesitated for a breath, then sat, wrapping her arms around herself beneath the wool. Her clothes were soaked. Her hair, dark and streaked with something dry and crusted, hung in tangled ropes. Her skin was scratched across the cheek, and her lip was split, but it was her eyes that told the most. Green, not soft green like meadow grass, sharp green, like mountain pine after a thunderstorm. A color that didn't blend in, but cut through, demanding to be seen. Caleb poured her a cup of coffee. He didn't ask if she drank it, just set it on the floor beside her chair, far enough not to crowd her, close enough to show he wasn't afraid. She stared at the steam curling upward, made no move to touch it, but her shoulders loosened a notch. He sat at the table, his own cup going cold in his hand. Outside, the wind shifted again, slamming against the windows with a hollow thump. The house creaked, the porch sighed, but inside, nothing moved. They didn't talk. Neither needed to. Something had already been said in the way she looked at that doorway. The kind of look that new doors don't always open. Sometimes they slam in your face, or worse, open with a promise they don't keep. He didn't know who she was, didn't know what had chased her all the way to this forgotten slice of Wyoming where no one ever came unless they were lost or running. But Caleb Rourke had seen enough weather, both in the sky and in people's faces, to know a storm when it stood trembling before him. She wouldn't last another night outside. The fire hissed softly, the coffee cooled, her breath steadied, and for the first time in nearly a decade, Caleb noticed something different in the air. Not the scent of another body, not even the soft crackle of old wool finding shape again. It was smaller than that. It was the sound of the house remembering how to hold more than one heartbeat. Part 3. Rearranging the chair by the window. The next morning, Caleb woke at the same time he always did, just before the light tipped over the far hills. The wind had died some during the night. What remained was a hush so still it seemed like the world was holding its breath. He moved slowly through the kitchen, like always, reached for the tin kettle, measured the grounds by hand, same scoop, same rhythm, 2 cups again, one for him, one for the empty chair. Only this time, when he turned, the girl was still there. She'd slept on the floor near the stove, curled into herself like an animal afraid of being noticed. The sweater swallowed her shoulders, her knees tucked under her chin. Her face looked softer in sleep, younger maybe, but no less guarded. Even unconscious, she kept her back to the wall. Caleb didn't wake her, he just poured both cups, set one on the table where he always did, and walked out to feed the horses. The sky had turned pale gray, the kind that doesn't promise rain or sun, just time passing. The horses greeted him with the same steady snorts, steam rising from their nostrils. He liked this part of the morning. It asked nothing of him but presence. When he came back inside, the fire had been fed, not by him. The girl stood in front of it, arms crossed beneath the heavy wool, hair still tangled, but now swept behind her ears. She didn't turn when he stepped inside, just stared at the flames like they were speaking to her in a language she almost understood. She didn't touch the coffee, but she didn't leave either. The second day passed quietly. She moved through the house like a ghost, except for the sound of her bare feet on the worn wood floor. At one point, Caleb saw her with a rag wiping down the front door's handle. Later, she swept dust from beneath the table. Slow, steady, like it mattered more than it did. He didn't ask her why. Some folks, when they hurt, they talk. Others, they move. By the third morning, she'd started the fire before he even stirred. He found her kneeling near the hearth, feeding kindling like it was a child she'd been entrusted to care for. Her face was lean, sun-shadowed, the split in her lip healing. She still hadn't spoken a word, but she'd moved the second chair, not the one across the table. That one hadn't been touched. Still stood where it always had, its cushion thin from use, one leg uneven from the day Ruth passed. No, she'd moved the old rocker from the corner, the one near the window that nobody ever used. Placed it just near the stove, angled to the glass, where light might reach it come noon. She sat in it for hours, watching, not him, not the door, just the world beyond it. Snow still patched the ground, though the air was warming some, the kind of warming that says spring's coming, but not today. That evening he heard the first sound of riders, far off, software but unmistakable. Hoofbeats, 5, maybe 6. The rhythm wasn't wild like cattle. It was the practiced cadence of men who didn't rush, but meant business when they arrived. Caleb stiffened. He stepped outside, scanned the horizon. Dust rose slowly and deliberately from the south ridge, still too far to make out faces, still too close to ignore. When he came back in, The girl had her hands wrapped tight around the coffee cup, the same one she hadn't touched before. He didn't speak, neither did she. He moved past her, took down the long bar for the front gate, locked it quiet, then checked the back latch, the one folks forgot was even there. He added another log to the fire. It didn't need it, but it made the room feel more ready. Later, as the sky burned low and the wind carried a different kind of silence, she stood beside the window. Her hand reached out and adjusted the curtain just an inch. That was all. But in that inch, Caleb understood. She'd seen them too, and she wasn't surprised. Part 4. Men from a past not buried. They came just before sundown, 5 of them, just as Caleb had counted by ear. Dusty, travel-worn men riding lean horses that moved with the ease of animals too used to long roads and hard weather. Their coats were trail-stained, guns slung without apology. Not loud men, but deliberate, the kind who didn't smile unless it was earned, and didn't ask unless they meant to take. The one in the lead didn't dismount right away. He sat tall in the saddle, a thick scar cutting down the left side of his face, like a knife wound that hadn't healed straight. His hat was low, shadowing his eyes, but his voice was clear when he spoke. Even in this here the Rourke place? Caleb stood on the porch, thumb resting against the rim of his belt buckle, but his fingers were close to the loop of the Henry rifle leaning against the doorpost. He nodded once. That's what they call it. The man nodded too, but it was the kind of nod a wolf might give a fence before leaping it. Name's Murdoch Slane. My boys and I are looking for a woman, mid-20s, black hair, been traveling on foot, maybe with a child, boy 8 or so. Caleb's face didn't change. Haven't seen anyone like that. Murdoch smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. She's not exactly lost. She's running. Came from a caravan under escort. Territory court sent 'em down from Bitter Ridge. Blood debt holders, you understand? I don't reckon I do. A lot of folks owe more than money out here, Murdoch said, letting his gaze wander to the barn, then the house windows. This woman, we're told she ain't kin to the boy, but she was. The last one seen holding him when the trouble hit. 2 dead. 1 kid vanished. Not looking to cause a stir, mister. Just need to bring her back where she belongs. Caleb let the quiet hang for a breath. Then another. He shifted his weight on the boards. That's a long trail to follow. Woman could be anywhere. Yeah, Murdoch said, his voice softening just a hair. But tracks brought us here. He dismounted then. Slow, easy. Dust swirled around his boots. You mind if we water the horses? Been a rough ride. Caleb didn't say yes. Didn't say no, either. But he stepped off the porch, walked toward the well, and cranked the handle with steady, practiced turns. The creak of the pump filled the air between men who didn't trust each other and never would. The other riders followed suit, unsaddling without waiting for permission. 2 stood watch without drawing attention to the fact. 1 scratched his chin and eyed the fence line. Another spit into the dirt. Caleb felt it all. Not with his eyes, but with that part of a man that learned to read danger long before it wore a badge or drew a blade. Inside the house, behind the drawn curtain, Annie didn't move. She'd seen the man before. Years ago, maybe. Months. She wasn't sure anymore, but there are some men you don't forget. Not for the way they speak, but for the way the air changes when they walk into it. Caleb brought the last bucket forward and set it near the trough. Murdoch stepped beside him, real close now. Too close. She's here, ain't she? Caleb met his eyes and said nothing. Murdoch chuckled low. I can smell the fear, Rourke. Ain't yours, though. He took a slow step back. Look, I ain't a monster, just a man with a job. You hand her over, this ends quietly, no fuss. You keep her, it gets messy, and I promise you, It ain't just you who pays the bill." Caleb's voice came low, steady. "This is my land. I don't recall giving it up for someone else's business." Murdoch nodded like he expected that, like he hoped for it. "Then we'll be back in the morning," he said, "with papers." He tipped his hat, but it wasn't respectful. It was a warning. By the time they rode off, the sun was little more than a red scar behind the hills. Caleb walked back inside. Annie sat in the rocker, her hands wrapped around the boy's wool scarf she kept folded in her lap. It was faded, fraying at the edges, and too small for a grown woman to bother with. But her fingers gripped it like it was the last thread tying her to something that once mattered. Caleb didn't speak. He just stood there. And in the space between them, across firelight, shadows, and silence, he saw the truth. She wasn't just running. She was remembering. And no matter how far she'd gone, that man, Murdoch slain, had come from a place she thought she'd escaped. Some ghosts ride horses. Part 5. A look that wasn't a stranger's anymore. The next morning broke slow, windless. A kind of hush had fallen over the plains, the kind that came before something changed. Not always trouble, not always peace, but something. Inside the house, the fire had burned low. Caleb stirred it back to life, careful not to wake Annie, who'd fallen asleep in the chair, the boy's scarf still curled in her hand. She hadn't spoken a word since Murdoch rode off the night before, but she hadn't tried to run either. That was something. By the time she woke, the scent of the black coffee lingered through the wood-planked kitchen. Caleb had poured 2 mugs. One rested where it always did, across from him, next to the chair no one sat in for nearly a decade. He didn't offer the second cup, but he didn't move it either. She noticed, didn't reach for it. But she noticed. The day passed without much noise. Annie swept the floor again, slower this time, paused by the window once when a hawk circled over the pasture. Caleb fixed a board on the front porch that had come loose in the last storm, nails held in his mouth, hammer swinging with a quiet rhythm. By late afternoon, Annie moved to the sink and began to wash the dishes that had been drying since morning. Caleb watched her from the doorway. The sun fell sideways through the slats, painting long shadows across the floor. "You do that like you've done it before," he said finally. She didn't answer right away. Then, without turning, she said softly, "A kitchen's a kitchen. Doesn't matter where it is." Caleb nodded. He stepped outside, leaned against the barn wall, watching the horizon. The wind had shifted, carried dust from the south. He knew what that meant. They'd be back. Murdoch didn't bluff. He wasn't the kind. The rusted blade of a skinning knife hung half loose from the pegboard near the barn door. Caleb took it down, turned it in his hands, the edge dull from disuse. The sun had warmed the metal, but it still felt cold. He didn't sharpen it, didn't need to. It wasn't a weapon, just a thing you held, when your mind turned over memories too heavy to carry barehanded. When he came back toward the house, Annie was standing on the porch. She didn't flinch when she saw the knife in his hand, didn't ask, didn't step aside. She just looked at him, a full, still look, not scared, not angry, something in between. "I can leave," she said, voice steady, "if that'll make it easier for you." Caleb rested the knife on the railing. "Easier for who?" Her eyes dropped to the ground. "For you, this land, your peace." He looked past her, through the screen door where the table sat, waiting for a supper he hadn't planned. "They'll still come," he said, "whether you're here or not." She swallowed. "They want me." "Then they'll find you," he said. "And if they don't, they'll find someone who looks like you. That's how men like that work. Ain't about justice. It's about finishing the job." She stepped down off the porch, just enough so they stood nearly even. "I don't want to keep running." "Then stop." Annie's breath hitched, just barely. She looked down at her boots, one of them stitched at the toe, and said, "I don't belong anywhere." Caleb tilted his head, studied her like he might study a wild horse near the fence line. Half starved, half wary, but still proud enough not to let you close without a reason. "Everybody belongs somewhere," he said. "Sometimes it just takes a while to find it." Silence settled again. Only this time it didn't stretch far. It stopped between them, not cold, not heavy, just quiet. Annie lifted her eyes to his. There wasn't any plea in them, just a tired kind of honesty that only people who'd run too far, too long, carried in their gaze. "If the boy ever finds his way back," she said, "he needs to know where to look." That was it. She didn't ask to stay. She just made it clear she already had. Caleb didn't answer with words. He reached out, opened the screen door, and stepped aside. She followed him in. That night, the second cup didn't go untouched. Part 6. A Storm in the Night and the First Bullet. The wind picked up just after sundown. One of those Wyoming winds that didn't bother to knock. It just pushed through the cracks in the walls, curled under the door, and moaned across the dry grass like it remembered things men forgot. Caleb sat at the table with his boots on, shoulders still, eyes on the wood grain. Annie was sewing again, the same wool coat she'd mended twice already. It wasn't about fixing anymore, just something to do with her hands. Neither spoke. Outside, a storm had begun to gather, not the kind that watered crops, but the kind that traveled on horseback. By nightfall, the dogs started to bark. Caleb didn't own dogs. He stood, walked to the window without rush. In the distance, across the pasture, lantern light flickered, a half circle of it moving slow, too organized to be lost riders. 5 men, 2 with rifles slung, 1 leading. Caleb didn't have to see the face to know it was Murdoch. He reached under the bench and pulled the rifle he hadn't touched in years. The stock still smelled of old oil and pine. He checked the chamber, empty. He loaded it 1 bullet at a time, slow, deliberate. Annie stood behind him. She didn't speak. Didn't need to, but when he turned, he saw her hand holding something out. His wife's old scarf, folded like a cloth over a jar. He took it. Inside was a box of cartridges, full, kept dry. "I found it in the cupboard," she said softly. "Next to the flower." Caleb gave a quiet nod. He tucked the scarf into his coat pocket. "They won't wait till morning," he said. "I know. You could still leave through the back." "I'm tired of leaving." That was the end of it. He stepped out into the dark, rifle in hand, boots crunching against frost-bitten soil. The barn stood like a shadow waiting. He moved past it toward the corral gate. Lanterns stopped about 30 paces out, lining the fence like eyes in the night. Then a voice. "You got something don't belong to you, Rourke?" It was Murdoch. No bluff in that voice. Just the tired weight of a man used to getting what he came for. Caleb didn't answer. "You're harboring a fugitive." Still nothing. Another voice, a younger one this time, chimed in, nervous. "She's tied to a court claim. You don't want to be on the wrong side of that, sir." Caleb raised his rifle, not fast, not threatening, but steady. "You bring a judge?" he called. Silence. "You bring a warrant?" No reply. "Then you brought nothing but noise." Murdoch stepped closer, holding a folded piece of paper in one hand and a coiled rope in the other. "Let's not make this worse than it has to be." At that, Caleb raised the rifle higher, shouldered it. He didn't aim for any man. He aimed for the tree beside the fence, just past Murdoch's right flank. The crack of the shot shattered the hush like a bone snapping under weight. Bark exploded. Horses bucked. 1 man cursed. The paper fluttered to the dirt, but no one fell. Caleb lowered the rifle. "That's the only warning you'll get," he said. "You'd kill a man over her?" Murdoch barked. Caleb didn't blink. "No." "Then what was that?" "I'd kill a man over peace." Murdoch stared, lips tight. Then he spat in the dirt, backed off a few paces. "This ain't done," he growled. "No, it ain't," Caleb said, "but it'll be on my land and my terms." The lanterns backed away one by one, like ghosts giving up a grudge, for now. When he stepped back inside, Annie was still at the table, hands wrapped around the second mug of coffee. It had gone cold. She didn't ask what happened. He didn't explain. But when he sat down, her voice broke the silence. "You missed on purpose." Caleb didn't look up. "First bullet always should." She nodded just once, and for the first time since she came, she reached across the table. Not far, not bold, just enough to push the second cup a little closer to his side. He didn't touch it. But he didn't push it back either. Part 7. The Old Dynamite and the Wooden Table. The morning after the shot, there was no talk of what had passed. Caleb woke at dawn, as he always did. The light coming through the east window barely caught the dust in the air. The sky had cleared but left behind a stillness too quiet for peace. Annie was already at the stove. No breakfast, just hot water over coffee grounds. She moved without noise, like her feet had learned the patterns of the house in the dark. Caleb sat at the table, the same seat as always. His rifle leaned against the wall behind him. The second cup was already poured. Steam is still rising. They drank in silence. Then he stood, walked out the back door, down past the pens, past the chicken coop half fallen to rot, to the far shed by the cottonwood tree. He hadn't opened that shed in years. The padlock was rusted, but it broke with one firm knock from a rock. Inside, the air was close. Old leather, sawdust, and something deeper, like the memory of smoke. On the left wall, hanging by a nail, was the crate. Wood warped with time, but the words still showed faint beneath the dust. Hercules Powder Company dynamite, wrapped in wax paper, packed in straw. He'd kept it since the dry years, when the creek went bone, and the only way to find water was to blast deep into the clay shelf. Hadn't touched it since. He picked it up gently, still light, still whole. Back at the house, Annie looked up when he returned, eyes catching the box in his hands. She didn't ask. He set it down on the wooden table beside the coffee pot and opened it slow. "This is what we do now?" she asked, voice quiet but not afraid. Caleb met her eyes. "I don't know what we do, but I know what I won't let happen here." Her gaze dropped to the bundle of sticks inside the crate. "How old are those?" "Old enough to be dangerous," he said. She nodded. "Then we use them right." They worked together without more talk. Caleb carried the dynamite. Annie brought wire from the old windmill shed. By dusk, they'd buried 3 charges under the main fence, places Murdoch and his men might cross if they came in riding hard. Not to kill, just to stop. Annie laid the wire like she'd done it before, hands steady, not a wasted motion, Caleb noticed. "You've handled this before," he said. She didn't look up. "My father used to clear tree stumps that way, back in Kansas, before the land was taken." No more was said. When the last of the wire was coiled and hidden beneath the dry grass, they walked back to the house together, not side by side, but not far apart either. The sky had turned gold behind the hills, streaked with a kind of color that only lasted a few breaths before night took it. Inside, Caleb sat down first. He reached for the coffee pot, but his hand stopped halfway. Annie was already pouring, 1 cup, then another. She set his cup down first, then took the other and sat across from him, in the seat she never once claimed before. Not the empty one he guarded like a gravestone, but the one by the window where the light touched half the table. They didn't drink right away, just sat with hands around the heat. "Why are you doing this?" she asked after a while, voice low. "For you." She looked over. "No," he said, "not for you, for what they might do to a place like this, to someone who thought they could finally stop running." Her eyes didn't turn away. "That's not nothing." He shook his head. "Number, but it's not everything either." Wind stirred the curtain. Coyotes howled in the far ridges, the kind of night sound you get used to when no one else is near. She leaned back in the chair, quiet. "You ever wonder if it's worth it?" He didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "Some things aren't about worth. Some things just are." The coffee went cold between them, but neither moved to reheat it. In the middle of the table, between the tin cups and a scatter of wire clippings, sat a single stick of unused dynamite. It hadn't found its place yet, but it waited, like them, quiet, patient, and ready if the time came. Part 8. A House with No Way Out. They came just after first light. The sun wasn't up yet, just a gray sheen over the horizon, like the land hadn't decided whether to wake. Caleb was already outside, boots planted in damp soil, wind tugging at the collar of his coat. He didn't need to hear hoofbeats to know they were coming. The birds were silent. Even the wind held its breath. From the ridge beyond the pasture, Murdoch Slane appeared first, coat flapping, rifle slung low, eyes fixed hard on the house, see, like it owed him something. Behind him rode 3 others. One of them, the youngest, looked nervous. The other 2 had the posture of men who'd done bad things more than once and stopped calling it wrong. Annie stood at the window. She didn't speak, just pressed one hand against the cold glass, watching the figures on horseback make their way through the dew-flecked sage. Her other hand was wrapped tight around the child's scarf, her knuckles white. Inside the shed by the corral, the wire lay hidden, buried beneath soft soil and dead grass. Caleb had placed the charges by hand, tamped them carefully like he'd once tamped fence posts in the years when the ranch was full of sound. The lead horse crossed the first marker, nothing. Then the second, still nothing. The third man's horse stepped past the last one, and the earth jumped. A boom rolled across the flatland, thunder without clouds, dust rising like a ghost. The horse reared. The rider flew sideways into the dirt. The others pulled up hard, spooked and wheeling. Murdoch didn't fall. He didn't flinch either, just stared through the smoke toward the house, lip curled. Then he dismounted. No rush, no fear, just pulled his revolver and walked. Caleb stepped out from behind the corral gate, rifle already shouldered. "Next one's real," he said, voice rough from dust and years of silence. Murdoch kept walking. The 2 gunmen behind him hesitated, looked at each other, then turned and galloped off, dust trailing like shame behind them. Murdoch stopped 10 paces from Caleb. "You always this dramatic, Rourke." Caleb said nothing. Murdoch spat. "She ain't yours to keep. She's wanted by the court, under her real name, and that boy she was with ain't her kin." Caleb kept the rifle level. "And yet here you are with no badge, no paper I'd trust, and no reason I believe. She broke the law. So did every man who ever came west." From the porch, Annie stepped out, barefoot, still holding the scarf. Murdoch turned to her. "I should have left you in the canyon with the rest." And that was it, the line that crossed something old and buried. Caleb fired. The crack of the rifle snapped through the still air. Murdoch dropped to one knee, hand clutching his shoulder. Not dead, not even bleeding too bad. But he wasn't walking straight for a while. Caleb didn't lower the rifle. "Next time, it won't be the shoulder." Murdoch met his eyes. What he saw there, years of grief, years of solitude, a man with nothing left to lose and something finally to protect, must have been enough. Because Murdoch rose slow, grit in his teeth, and limped back to his horse. "You'll regret this," he muttered. Caleb didn't answer. He just watched until the horse's tail disappeared into the horizon dust. Annie stood silent on the porch, her face unreadable. Then she looked down at the scarf, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she let it go. The wind caught it. It blew across the yard, fluttered once, then settled near the firewood pile. She walked down the steps, past Caleb, past the corral. She picked up the scarf, folded it neat, and placed it in the tin box beside the door. "Why'd you do it?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Caleb didn't turn. "Because sometimes the only thing you can do is make sure someone knows they ain't alone." She looked at him, not like a stranger anymore, then walked back inside. Later, when the fire was lit and coffee brewed, she poured 2 cups again, and this time she didn't wait for him to sit before sliding one across the table. Part 9. The Story of the Boy. That night the wind blew softer, no gunshots, no hoofbeats, no threats riding in from the horizon, just the low hum of crickets near the barn and the creak of old beams settling into the quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't feel like absence anymore, more like the way a home breathes once it's been reminded someone still listens. Caleb sat by the stove, boots off, one hand curled around the chipped rim of a coffee mug. The fire snapped gently, its light dancing along the floorboards, worn smooth by years of no one walking them. Annie was on the rug, knees pulled up, the scarf folded once more in her lap. She hadn't spoken since midday, but her silence didn't feel shut tight anymore. It felt waiting. The kind of silence before someone tells the kind of truth that's never been put into words out loud. She ran a finger along the edge of the fabric. Then, softly, like the words had been steeping in her chest too long, "His name's Toby." Caleb looked up. Annie didn't look back. "I knew his folks. We weren't blood, not even close, really, just neighbors on the same wagon train, 2 valleys over, before the raids came." Her voice didn't shake, but it cracked in places like old porchwood. "The night they died, we were camped near a wash. I heard gunfire, but by the time I got there, only thing left breathing was him, covered in dust, holding his little blanket, like it was all that kept the world from swallowing him whole." She finally looked up. Her eyes didn't ask for pity, just understanding. "I ran, took him with me, stayed ahead of the wrong men for a while, changed towns, cut my hair, slept in cellars. But bounty men don't care about the truth, just the price tag." Caleb leaned forward, elbows on knees, listening like the way he'd listen for a coyote in the dark, alert, steady, with something deep in his chest tightening that he couldn't quite name. "They caught us outside Rawlins, said they had orders from some claim back east, blood money owed by Toby's father. They separated us before I could even scream. He cried the whole time. I haven't seen him since." She blinked. "Once. He can't sleep without that blanket. Even used to drag it into the bath. I only managed to keep this corner of it when I slipped free." She held it up, just a small square of flannel, frayed at the edge, one button hanging loose. "I'm not his mother. No court would say I had the right to him. But I chose him, Caleb. In a world that took everything from both of us, I chose him." She set the square gently on the floor, as if laying down a life. Then she said nothing else, and that was the part that gutted more than the words. The way she didn't plead, didn't explain further, didn't ask for any kind of promise or pity, just stopped. Caleb looked into the fire. It crackled low, licking around the split oak logs like it knew the ache of holding warmth in a place too used to cold. He reached behind the chair, slow like muscle memory, and pulled something from the wall, a thin piece of cedar board, the edges smoothed by time. He turned it in his hands once, then twice. before gently feeding it into the flames. Annie looked at him. He didn't explain. But the carved notches along the board had been visible, faint but still there. Scratches like a height chart, a child's growing years that never got finished. He hadn't pulled that board down in nearly a decade. Annie watched it burn, watched something in him soften, not break, not burst, but soften like snow starting to melt after a long-held frost. Then she stood, walked to the stove, poured one more cup of coffee, set it beside him. No words, but her hands didn't tremble. And for the first time, neither did his. Part 10. The Mailman and the Envelope with No Name. Spring crept in slowly that year. Not the loud kind, all bursting buds and prairie thunder. This one came quiet, like a man knocking soft on a door he wasn't sure he was welcome to open. The frost held on longer than usual, but each morning the icicles on the porch eaves shrank just a breath more, and the wind began to smell less like iron and more like pine sap and damp earth. Caleb was oiling hinges when the mailman came. It had been weeks since the last delivery. Ranch this far out didn't get much more than catalog scraps or cattle weight permits. But today the rider swung down with something in hand, something small and flat. Figured this might be personal, the man said, handing over an envelope with no return name. Caleb nodded once, took it in his calloused hand, and didn't open it right away. He waited until the man's horse disappeared behind the cottonwood bend, until the only sound left was a hawk circling above and the creak of the saddle Caleb hadn't ridden in weeks. Then he stepped inside. The kitchen smelled like coffee again. Not burnt, not bitter, just strong and warm, like the kind made for sharing. Annie was sewing by the fire, that same flannel square folded on her lap like a ritual. She looked up as he entered, but didn't ask. He sat down at the table, turned the envelope over. The handwriting was rough, charcoal maybe, just a smudged pair of initials near the corner, A and T, scratched together like they'd been practicing for weeks on a barn wall before daring to send it. No stamp, just string. He opened it carefully. Inside, a scrap of paper, yellowed, torn from a ledger or the back of a poster, and drawn in thick, determined lines, was a house with smoke rising from the chimney and a sun rising in the corner. Two stick figures stood in front, one tall, one short. The smaller one held what looked like a blanket with a smiley face on it. And beneath it all, written in crooked letters that tilted uphill like they were climbing toward something, I remember. I'm safe. Toby.
Caleb didn't move for a long while. Then he stood, walked to Annie, and held the paper out. She took it with both hands. Slow, careful. When she saw the drawing, those crooked lines and sunray scribbles, her breath caught, sharp like the moment a wound splits, not from hurt, but from finally healing. Her fingers trembled just barely as she traced the letters. Then her shoulders dropped, not from sadness, but relief, like she could finally set something down after carrying it too many miles too long. Caleb didn't say anything. He just poured a second cup, placed it beside hers, and sat down again. Outside, the last snow melted off the edge of the roof. The land didn't feel empty anymore. Part 11. Fixing the bell. Caleb hadn't touched the bell in years. It hung crooked on the porch beam, rust curling around the rim like dried blood. Wind had knocked it off center last fall, and since then it had clanged in odd, lopsided tones, neither calling nor warning, just a hollow sound, without meaning. But that morning, with the envelope folded and tucked under the worn corner of the ledger book, he fetched the ladder from behind the shed. The sun hadn't risen all the way. There was still a sleepy pink smudge to the east, and the frost on the railing caught the light like old glass. He climbed steady, boots careful on each rung. His shoulder ached from the last cold snap, and his fingers didn't bend like they used to. But he took his time.
not because it had to be perfect, just because some things, some small things, deserved not to be rushed. Below, Annie sat on the steps with a patch of his old coat draped across her lap. She'd pulled red thread from one of her own shawls and was using it to mend a split seam along the shoulder. Her hands were sure now, still quiet but not trembling. They hadn't spoken about the drawing again. Didn't need to. She'd left it by the hearth that evening, not hidden, just resting atop the mantel, folded so only the two initials showed. As if to say, he exists, and maybe so do we. Caleb unhooked the bell from the bent nail, turned it in his hand. The crack was deeper than he thought. The clapper still worked, though, just needed straightening. He sanded the rim with a strip of old leather, twisted wire back into place, and when he hung it again, it sat level, steady, ready. He didn't ring it, just listened to the wind brush past. When he climbed down, Annie looked up and smiled, small, almost shy, a smile not for show, not for thanks, just a smile like a fence post holding strong after a long winter. That day passed without visitors, no strangers, no letters. Caleb split logs for the stove. Annie baked something close to bread using cornmeal and lard. It crumbled, but they ate it warm with butter and silence. In the afternoon, he built an extra hook beside the door, not for a rifle, not for a lantern, just for another coat. He didn't say why. Annie didn't ask. But that night, when she hung the mended coat on the new hook, her fingers paused. Then she stepped back, looked at it, and nodded to herself. The hook held, and outside the bell didn't clang. It waited, quiet, sure, and whole. Part 12, a spring where no one left anymore. The snow had gone. What little ice remained was hiding in the shadows beneath fence posts and under the eaves. Mud gave way to dust. The wind smelled less like iron, more like pine and thawed grass. Spring in Wyoming didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept in quiet, careful, like a child unsure if it was welcome. That morning, Caleb stood at the porch rail, hands wrapped around a tin cup, coffee cooling slow. The old bell above him hung still in the breeze. Not a sound. He'd fixed the gate 2 days ago, tightened the hinge, oiled the latch, not because it needed it, but because some part of him had started tending to things again, things that once had no use. From the barn came the familiar creak of the stall door. Annie was inside, brushing down the mare, humming a melody too soft to name. She spent more time with the animals now, moving calm between saddle tack and hay, like she'd always known such routines. Not a guest, not a ghost, just part of the place. Caleb glanced toward the rise at the end of the trail. It was empty, same as it had been for months, but his eyes stayed there longer than they used to. Then the wind shifted. Soft footsteps, small ones, crunched on the gravel just beyond the fence. He turned. A woman approached from the east road, leading a boy by the hand. She didn't wear a badge or carry a ledger, just a worn satchel and a wide-brimmed hat, the kind worn by folks who didn't ask for thanks. The boy had hair like sun-dried wheat and shoes too big for his feet. He walked quietly, eyes sharp, scar on his left cheek like a half-healed whisper. Annie stepped out of the barn before the boy reached the gate. She didn't run. She walked, careful, slow, like every step was trying to hold back something bigger than the moment. The woman said nothing, just let go of the boy's hand and touched his back once, gently. Then she turned and walked away. Annie dropped to her knees in the dirt. The boy looked at her, uncertain. Then she held out something, a small square of cloth. His blanket, the one he'd clung to in sleep before the world turned cruel. He blinked, took it, then threw both arms around her neck. Caleb didn't move, just watched. After a while, the boy looked toward him, eyes curious, not afraid. "Who are you?" the boy asked. Caleb knelt, slow, knees cracking, and offered a hand, not outstretched in command, just steady, palm up. "I live here," he said, "and if you want, this can be home." The boy didn't answer, but he nodded, just once. Inside, 3 cups of coffee waited, no longer steaming like before, but still warm. The chair that had sat empty for years now had a small flannel blanket folded on the seat. The boy climbed up and reached for the cup without asking. Annie poured, and Caleb, he just sat, not alone, not anymore. Outside, the wind bent the grass like it always had. But this time it didn't sound like sorrow. It sounded like staying. Some folks say the West was built by grit and gunpowder. But out here, where wind wears down the strongest stone, it's the quiet things that hold a life together. A chair is no longer empty, a fire is still burning, and 3 coffee cups that never go cold. If this story settled somewhere quiet in you, tell me what part stayed. Not for the numbers, just so I know someone else out there heard it too. I'll be here, same porch, same wind, until the next story.